The spotlight fades, and the stage grows quiet. Somewhere in the haze of old film reels, a voice once soared, elegant, fearless, unforgettable. She sang with the warmth of jazz and carried herself with the grace of a movie star. Her name was Barbara McNair, a woman who broke barriers long before Hollywood was ready to see her shine. She conquered stages, screens, and even hosted her own television show when few believed a black woman could. But how does someone who once stood beside legends from Nat King Cole to Elvis Presley end up nearly forgotten? In an age of bright lights and quiet prejudice, Barbara McNair's story was more than music or fame. It was courage, refinement, and the price of being ahead of her time. Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Barbara Jean McNair was born on the 1st of January 1934 in Chicago, Illinois, but her earliest memories belong to the small-town rhythm of Racine, Wisconsin. It was a quiet place where dreams often seemed too big for the horizon. Yet Barbara found her own kind of magic in the sound of church choirs and school stages. Her parents, Horace and Claudia, believed that faith and hard work could open any door, even the doors Hollywood had kept closed for so long. From an early age, Barbara's voice carried a confidence far beyond her years. At Washington Park High School, she sang at every school assembly, her voice smooth and controlled, like she had been born on stage. In 1952, she graduated and moved on to the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago, determined to refine the gift she already knew was rare. But education, she would soon learn, could only take her so far. For Barbara, the lessons she needed weren't found in textbooks, they waited in the world beyond the classroom. After a brief period at UCLA, she made a bold decision. She left college behind, trading certainty for possibility, and packed her life into a few suitcases. Her destination was New York City, the city where art, ambition, and heartbreak shared the same narrow streets. In those early days, Barbara worked as a secretary for the National Foundation of Settlements. It was a job that paid the bills but starved her spirit. Each evening, she would walk past glowing club marquees, imagining her name in lights. She auditioned relentlessly across Manhattan, only to be turned down more times than she could count. The rejection didn't break her, it refined her. One night, after yet another failed audition, she found herself sitting in a small jazz club in Greenwich Village. The piano was out of tune, the room thick with smoke, and yet the air felt electric. A friend dared her to take the stage during an open mic. Barbara smiled, stood up, and sang. The room fell silent, not out of politeness, but because something rare had just happened. Her voice filled that smoky air like a promise. That performance changed everything. Soon, legendary club owner Max Gordon booked her at the Village Vanguard, one of New York's most respected venues. It was the kind of place where voices became careers. Barbara's blend of sophistication and soul made her stand out instantly. The newspapers began to take notice, and within months, she was invited to perform on the Arthur Godfrey Talent Show and the Ed Sullivan Show, two of the most watched programs in America. For a young black woman in the late 1950s, those appearances were more than milestones. They were small acts of revolution. America was still divided by race, yet Barbara stood on national television polished, confident, unbothered, representing a new kind of beauty and grace that defied stereotypes. She was not loud or defiant, she simply was, and that presence alone spoke volumes. Her performances caught the attention of columnist Walter Winchell during a run at a Las Vegas casino. His glowing review opened another door, a record deal with Coral Records. In 1958, Barbara released her debut single, Till There Was You, followed by Bobby. The songs captured the tenderness of her voice, though radio programmers often hesitated to play music that didn't fit the mold of what they expected from a black artist. Still, Barbara pushed forward. She returned to Broadway with The Body Beautiful, and later The Pajama Game, balancing her love of singing with a growing interest in acting. She was learning that success in show business wasn't just about talent, it was about resilience, patience, and timing. By the end of the decade, Barbara McNair was no longer the girl from Racine, Wisconsin, chasing a dream. She had stepped into it fully, bravely, and with unmistakable grace. Each stage, each spotlight, each hesitant applause carried her closer to the world that once felt too far away. Before the red carpets, before the fame, There was just a young woman with a dream and a voice that refused to be forgotten. By the end of the 1950, Barbara McNair had become a familiar name in clubs from New York to Las Vegas. The girl who once sang in church halls was now performing under soft stage lights, her voice echoing through packed rooms where people came to forget their troubles and listen to something pure. Her elegance set her apart. In an industry that often thrived on spectacle, Barbara brought restraint, a quiet kind of power that made audiences lean in rather than look away. Her first record deal came with Coral Records, a major step for any young artist at the time. In 1958, she released Till There Was You, a tender ballad that showcased her clarity and control. The song received modest attention, but critics praised her poise, noting how she delivered lyrics as if she were sharing a secret rather than performing. That same year, she recorded He's Got the Whole World in His Hands and Indiscreet, both of which highlighted her ability to blend jazz phrasing with pop sensibility, a rare versatility for a black female vocalist in a segregated America. Barbara's stage presence soon found a new home on Broadway. In The Body Beautiful and later The Pajama Game, she proved that her artistry wasn't confined to a microphone. She could act, dance, and hold an audience through sheer magnetism. When she toured with Nat King Cole, the collaboration felt almost symbolic, a torch passed from one generation of refined performers to another. Cole's gentle mentorship helped her navigate the unspoken politics of the entertainment world, where grace was sometimes the only armor she had. Still, the path forward was not easy. Record executives wanted her to sound softer, less soulful, more commercial, as if her own identity needed to be trimmed to fit someone else's idea of success. Barbara resisted politely but firmly. She knew that her style, a balance of polish and authenticity, was her strength, not her flaw. In 1961, she signed with Signature Records and released That's All I Want From You. It wasn't a chart topper, but it solidified her as an artist of consistency and class. By then, she was a regular guest on television programs like The Tonight Show and The Ed Sullivan Show, where millions of American households could see a black woman who was refined, elegant, and entirely her own. Her rise mirrored the cultural shift of the early 1960s, when black performers began moving from nightclub stages into mainstream America's living rooms. Barbara McNair wasn't just singing songs, she was quietly rewriting the image of what a star could look and sound like. Every performance, every small victory, chipped away at barriers that had stood for decades. And though fame was still elusive, recognition was beginning to find her. It wouldn't be long before the world and Motown came calling. When Barbara McNair walked through the doors of Motown in 1965, she entered a world that was both exhilarating and uncertain. The label, already home to rising stars like the Supremes and Marvin Gaye, was shaping the sound of a new America. Yet Barbara's voice, poised and sophisticated, didn't quite fit the youthful energy that Motown was known for. She wasn't chasing teenage audiences, she was offering class, control, and a kind of elegance that couldn't be packaged. Her debut single for the label, You're Gonna Love My Baby, proved exactly that. It was tender yet confident, soulful without surrendering her refined tone. Critics praised it as one of Motown's most underrated releases of the decade. Listeners, especially those in northern clubs of England, later embraced the track as a gem of the Northern Soul movement, a revival that would arrive years after Motown had moved on. Still, Barbara wasn't the type of artist who waited for recognition. She recorded Everything Is Good About You and My Whole World Is Empty Without You, songs that balanced melancholy with grace. They didn't climb the charts, but they carried an emotional weight that her audience never forgot. Even when Berry Gordy initially rejected one of her strongest songs, the bootleg copies circulating among DJs proved otherwise. Her music had found a home in hearts long before it found a place on lists. While many artists defined Motown through rhythm and groove, Barbara represented something rarer, dignity. Her image contrasted sharply with the pop glamour around her. She performed in elegant gowns, with a quiet authority that commanded respect rather than demanded attention. On stage, she was less about flash and more about feeling. Her versatility soon drew her beyond the recording studio. Hollywood took notice. By 1963, she had already made her film debut in Spencer's Mountain, but now offers began to grow. Her ability to balance warmth and intelligence made her a natural for television and film spaces where representation still lagged far behind reality. When she appeared on shows like Doctor, Kildare, I Spy, and Hogan's Heroes, audiences saw something that was still rare in American media: a black woman portrayed with sophistication and composure, not stereotype. It was a quiet revolution, and Barbara carried it without bitterness or bravado. She simply showed up and excelled. Motown gave her visibility, but it also showed her the limits of the industry's imagination. The label wanted stars who fit the formula, and Barbara refused to be reduced to one. By 1968, she had left Motown on her own terms, proud but aware of what could have been. Her next chapter would prove that she didn't need the label to define her. In 1968, she starred in If He Hollers Let Him Go, a powerful film that explored race, love, and justice. The following year, she co-starred with Elvis Presley in Change of Habit, a bold, tender role that brought her before millions who had never heard her name. To many, she seemed unstoppable. But for Barbara McNair, success was never just about applause. It was about purpose, about being seen as she truly was. And for a brief, shining moment, Hollywood finally saw her. By the late 1960s, Barbara McNair had reached the kind of visibility few women of color had ever known in American entertainment. She was not only performing before packed theaters and sold-out nightclubs, she was stepping into living rooms across the nation. In 1969, she became one of the first black women in history to host her own nationally syndicated television show, The Barbara McNair Show. For 3 seasons, she welcomed some of the biggest names in music from Ray Charles to Johnny Mathis, and stood among them as an equal. The show was warm, classy, and unapologetically refined. Barbara didn't chase trends or shock audiences. She drew them in with charm and intellect. She dressed in elegant gowns, introduced her guests with wit and sincerity, and carried herself like she belonged because she did. Each episode of her show reflected something quietly revolutionary. At a time when American television still portrayed African Americans through limited roles, Barbara McNair embodied sophistication. She wasn't there to make a political statement. Her existence on that screen was the statement. She sang, laughed, and conversed with white and black entertainers alike, showing a country still divided by race what equality could look like when lived with grace. Meanwhile, her acting career continued to rise. She starred in If He Hollers Let Him Go, 1968, a powerful drama confronting racial injustice, and followed it with a major role opposite Elvis Presley in Change of Habit, 1969. Sharing the screen with one of the most famous men in America, Barbara exuded calm confidence. Her performance brought depth and poise, challenging the one-dimensional portrayals often given to black women in Hollywood films. Then came They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, in 1970, the highly anticipated sequel to the Oscar-winning In the Heat of the Night. Acting alongside Sidney Poitier, Barbara portrayed his wife elegant, intelligent, grounded. It wasn't just a role. It was representation, the kind that told millions of viewers that a black woman could be beautiful, respected, and complex all at once. Audiences adored her, critics admired her, and peers respected her. For Barbara, this was the culmination of decades of persistence. She had finally arrived at the summit, a place she had been climbing toward since the nights she sang in smoky New York clubs. But with success came a quiet kind of isolation. Fame, especially for a woman who refused to compromise, could be lonely. Even as her name appeared in bright letters, Barbara often found herself reflecting on the cost of it all. Still, in those years, her light burned brightly. She was a pioneer, a performer, and a portrait of grace in an industry that rarely rewarded it. Under the hot lights of Hollywood, Barbara McNair shone not because she wanted to be seen, but because she had something to say. And for a moment, the whole world listened. Behind the applause and television lights, Barbara McNair carried the weight of something no spotlight could illuminate: the pressure of being a symbol in an era that demanded perfection from those who broke barriers. By 1971, she had become one of the most respected women in entertainment. But that respect came with expectations she never asked for. Hollywood loved her elegance, but rarely gave her the freedom to be human. She had to smile flawlessly, speak carefully, and embody an image of grace that left no room for mistakes. The same qualities that made her extraordinary also isolated her. Producers adored her professionalism but struggled to see her beyond the refined roles they created. Casting directors often described her as too polished, a coded phrase that reflected both admiration and limitation. Barbara understood the subtext. She was being celebrated for fitting in, not for standing out. Motown had once promised a family, but Hollywood was lonelier. Her show ended in 1972, not because of scandal or decline in talent, but because networks shifted focus toward younger, more sensational acts. Barbara didn't chase trends, and that decision, though graceful, came with a cost. The entertainment world was changing rapidly, and in the midst of that evolution, timelessness often looked like resistance. Even so, she continued to perform. Nightclubs still welcomed her. Audiences still adored her voice. But behind the curtain, there were signs of exhaustion. She was working harder than ever to maintain the life she had built, moving between film sets, stage shows, and television guest appearances. The rhythm that once felt exhilarating began to feel heavy. Then, in October 1972, her world shifted. Barbara was arrested for alleged possession of heroin after signing for a package delivered to her home. The headlines were brutal, another celebrity scandal for the press to consume. Few cared that she denied any knowledge of the package or that her husband, Rick Manzi, was later charged and the case against her was dropped. The damage was already done. In an industry built on image, innocence rarely mattered once suspicion took hold. Hollywood, always quick to move on, did just that. Offers slowed, calls stopped, and the same people who once praised her elegance now distanced themselves quietly. Barbara, who had spent years perfecting her craft and reputation, saw her career unravel in whispers. Yet, she refused to surrender to bitterness. In interviews, she remained composed, choosing dignity over anger. She retreated from the spotlight for a while, focusing on herself and the fragments of peace she could still find. Tennis, skiing, and small club performances became her refuge, quiet spaces where fame couldn't intrude. There was something profoundly human about that choice. Barbara McNair, once the face of television charm and musical poise, learned to live without applause. She had climbed to the top of an industry that had never fully embraced her, and now she was learning to exist beyond it. In the dim light of fading fame, she discovered something real, that worth was not measured in reviews or ratings, but in endurance. Her story, like her songs, carried both beauty and ache. The woman who once sang to the world was now singing for herself. And though the audience was smaller, the truth in her voice had never been clearer. The arrest in 1972 marked a turning point Barbara McNair could never have anticipated. For years, she had lived by grace, professionalism, and restraint, yet in a single moment, all that composure was tested. The image of Barbara, handcuffed at the Playboy Club, splashed across newspapers nationwide, shocked audiences who had once seen her as the very definition of elegance. She insisted she was innocent, and the facts would later prove her right. The package she had signed for containing heroin was traced to her husband, Rick Manzi, who had ties to organized crime. But truth in Hollywood rarely traveled as fast as scandal. By the time the charges against her were dropped in April 1973, the damage had already seeped into her reputation. For a woman who had spent her entire career walking the fine line between acceptance and exclusion, this was more than humiliation. It was erasure. The same press that once praised her poise now questioned her integrity. Nightclubs hesitated to book her. Television networks distanced themselves. Friends stopped calling. Barbara's response was characteristically quiet. She didn't hold press conferences or make public pleas. Instead, she withdrew, choosing silence over spectacle. In that silence, though, she faced the darker truths of fame, that the world's memory was short, and its forgiveness even shorter. Her husband's death in 1976 compounded the pain. Whatever complications their marriage had endured, the loss was still heavy. She found herself alone in Los Angeles, managing debts, fading opportunities, and the haunting echo of what her life used to be. In 1987, bankruptcy became unavoidable. The numbers were staggering, nearly $500,000 owed, the result of a career that had once seemed untouchable. And yet, through it all, Barbara McNair refused to let bitterness define her. She kept her routine: simple tennis in the morning, skiing when she could, evenings spent reflecting on what remained. She still performed occasionally, her voice slightly rougher but her delivery deeper, wiser. In small venues scattered across the country, devoted fans still came to hear her. They remembered the woman she had been and the strength she still carried. For Barbara, the applause was no longer about validation. It was about connection. Each song became a conversation with the past, a dialogue between the woman she once was and the survivor she had become. Hollywood had turned the page, but Barbara kept writing her own story, even if no one was watching. There was tragedy in her fall, yes, but also a quiet kind of triumph, the kind that comes from surviving the silence. And as the lights dimmed around her, Barbara McNair proved that grace wasn't what she wore on stage, it was what she held on to when everything else was gone. When the storm passed, Barbara McNair was still standing, but the world she once knew was gone. Hollywood had moved on to newer faces, fresher sounds, and louder stories. The quiet dignity that once made her so unique now seemed out of step with an industry obsessed with youth and spectacle. Her name, once printed in bold on marquees, became a footnote in programs and press clippings. But Barbara never saw herself as a victim. She understood that fame was temporary, and she had already lived long enough to see how quickly admiration could fade. Instead, she leaned into what remained her craft, her discipline, and her unshakable sense of self. In the late 1970s, she began performing again, often in smaller venues where the spotlight was softer, but the audiences more sincere. Her sets were intimate, her voice carrying the weight of experience. There was no glitter, no choreography, no desperate attempt to reclaim the past, just truth. When she sang, people listened differently now. Every lyric carried the echo of a life lived both in and beyond the spotlight. Still, the industry's silence lingered. Producers who once praised her versatility now avoided risk. Opportunities came rarely, and when they did, they were often fleeting. Barbara accepted that reality without resentment. She had once performed for millions. Now she performed for dozens. Yet in those quiet rooms, she found a peace the stage had never given her. By the 1980s, Barbara began rebuilding her presence. She took a recurring role on General Hospital in 1984, marking her return to television after more than a decade away. The performance reminded audiences of what they had nearly forgotten: her charisma, her composure, her rare ability to say more in silence than most could in a speech. In 1987, the same year she filed for bankruptcy, she also finalized her divorce from Ben Strahan. It was a difficult year, yet she faced it with the same quiet endurance that had defined her life. She had been married 5 times, and through each chapter, she kept searching for connection, not for glamour, but for peace. Barbara's final marriage, to Charles Blee in 2006, gave her that. After decades of movement and reinvention, she finally found stillness. Though her health was failing, she continued to speak softly about gratitude, about the joy of having lived many lives in one. When throat cancer took her in 2007 at the age of 72, she left not in scandal or sorrow, but in quiet grace. There were no headlines shouting her name, no grand farewell on television. But for those who remembered her, those who had watched her sing, act, or simply carry herself with dignity, her loss felt deeply personal. Barbara McNair had faced the worst the industry could offer and met it with unshakable strength. She didn't fade away, she transformed. And in that transformation, she found her truest legacy: peace. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the stages dimmed, Barbara McNair's influence continued to echo quietly across generations. She never achieved the commercial fame of Motown's biggest stars, nor the cinematic superstardom of her peers, but her contribution was something deeper. She expanded the image of what a black woman could be in American entertainment. In an era that often demanded conformity, Barbara stood for refinement. She was one of the first to bridge the worlds of jazz, pop, and television with effortless sophistication. Her performances on The Barbara McNair Show offered America a vision rarely seen at the time. A black woman hosting with charm, interviewing white and black artists as equals, singing songs that spoke not of race, but of humanity. It was quiet integration, not through protest, but through presence. Her legacy also lived in the artists who came after her. The path she cleared made it easier for performers like Diahann Carroll, Diana Ross, Whitney Houston, and even later generations such as Halle Berry to step into roles of grace and authority without apology. Each of them, in their own way, inherited something from Barbara, the understanding that dignity itself could be revolutionary. Musically, her recordings may not have topped charts, but they found new life in unexpected places. During the 1980 and 1990, the Northern Soul movement in the United Kingdom rediscovered "You're Gonna Love My Baby and Everything Is Good About You," spinning them in dance halls packed with fans who celebrated forgotten gems of American soul. Across the ocean, Barbara's voice was finally receiving the recognition that had eluded her at home. Her acting, too, left subtle fingerprints on Hollywood. In films like They Call Me Mr. Tibbs and Change of Habit, she defied stereotypes simply by existing in roles of depth and respectability. For audiences of color, seeing Barbara McNair share the screen with Elvis Presley or Sidney Poitier was a reminder that inclusion wasn't charity, it was overdue acknowledgement. Barbara's poise became her power. Even when the industry overlooked her, she never compromised who she was. The same calm grace that once made her seem too polished later became the hallmark of professionalism for women navigating Hollywood's unpredictable tides. Beyond performance, Barbara's resilience became part of her story. She endured public humiliation, personal loss, and financial hardship, yet never abandoned her integrity. Her life was proof that fame might be fleeting, but character endures. In many ways, her greatest role wasn't in film or television. It was in showing the world how to carry oneself when the spotlight fades. She didn't rage against being forgotten. She accepted it with a kind of quiet pride, knowing she had done her part in pushing the door open for others. Barbara McNair may not have been remembered by the industry that once applauded her, but her light still lingers not in the headlines, but in the hearts of those who see in her story a reflection of perseverance, grace, and truth. When Barbara McNair passed away in 2007, the news barely made national headlines. There were no special tributes on television, no elaborate retrospectives celebrating her life. But for those who had followed her journey, musicians, actors, and loyal fans, her death felt like the quiet closing of a golden era. It wasn't just that an artist had died, it was that a kind of elegance had gone with her. In the years that followed, something remarkable happened. Across online forums, classic film blogs, and jazz communities, her name began to resurface. Younger audiences who had never seen her live discovered her performances on digital archives. Clips from the Barbara McNair show began circulating again, revealing the warmth and confidence that once captivated millions. People who had grown up watching her in the late 1960s left comments filled with nostalgia, remembering not just her talent, but the grace she carried through turbulent times. American critics, revisiting her work, began to acknowledge what earlier generations had overlooked. They wrote of her as a trailblazer of quiet power, someone who had made her mark not by demanding space, but by occupying it with dignity. Film historians re-examined They Call Me Mr. Tibbs and Change of Habit, noting how her presence softened the edges of those films, giving them humanity and warmth. In an industry that often flattened black women into caricatures, Barbara had offered complexity. Her musical contributions also gained renewed appreciation. Vinyl collectors began hunting for original choral and Motown pressings of her singles. Soul revivalists in the United Kingdom continued spinning her tracks at all-night dances, calling them hidden treasures of an era that still feels too short. DJs and modern soul enthusiasts credited Barbara McNair as part of the lineage that shaped the sophisticated side of American R&B. Yet perhaps her most enduring legacy lies in how her story resonates today. For black women in entertainment navigating the pressures of perfection, Barbara's journey remains both cautionary and inspiring. She showed that visibility is not the same as acceptance, and that success, when achieved with grace, can still carry loneliness. But she also proved that integrity, the refusal to be molded into someone else's idea of worth, leaves a deeper mark than any fame could. In recent years, small tributes have emerged, jazz festivals honoring her name, Motown retrospectives featuring her songs, and fan-made documentaries chronicling her contributions. Slowly, the silence surrounding her began to break. Barbara McNair's rediscovery is not about rewriting history. It's about finishing it. She wasn't forgotten because she lacked greatness. She was forgotten because she lived in a time that wasn't ready to celebrate her fully. But now, in a world finally looking back with empathy, her voice rings clearer than ever. As the years pass, her story continues to move those who listen closely, a reminder that true legacy doesn't fade. It waits patiently to be remembered. The spotlight that once followed Barbara McNair has long gone dark. The applause faded, the cameras stopped, and yet her presence, that quiet strength, that poised confidence, never truly disappeared. Somewhere between the forgotten reels of Hollywood and the timeless rhythm of Motown, her story still breathes. Barbara's journey was never about chasing fame. It was about standing tall in a world that often asked her to shrink. She entered rooms where few women of color had ever been invited, and she carried herself as if she had always belonged there. She broke barriers not with noise, but with elegance, and for that, her legacy remains eternal. When we look back now, her life feels like a mirror, reflecting both triumph and truth. She showed us that beauty isn't just in success, it's in resilience. That grace isn't about perfection, it's about endurance. And that sometimes, the bravest thing an artist can do is simply remain herself when the world demands otherwise. Her songs still echo, her performances still inspire, and her image, radiant and unbending, reminds us that some stars don't fade. They just move to quieter skies. Barbara McNair's story is more than history. It's a promise that every voice silenced by time will one day be heard again. So tonight, as we remember her, take a moment to think of the artists who once lit up the world and then slipped into its shadows. They deserve to be remembered not just for what they achieved, but for what they endured. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Barbara McNair the respect she truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and share your favorite memory or song, because remembering is how we keep their light alive. The world may have forgotten, but we remember. Always.